Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Canon 211 on the Paleocrat Diaries. I am your host. My name is Jake Fowler, and I am welcoming this morning, bright and early, Noah Bradon of the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame. Noah, welcome to the program.
Hey, Jake, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to spend my morning together with you.
We've had quite a morning already trying to troubleshoot and the interwebs conspiring against us once more. No, I did not.
That we need a little more coffee, I guess,
More coffee, absolutely. Look, I don't do long, boring bios the way Larry Chapp does, long, boring bios. I just get straight to it. I said where you worked. You write, right? You teach, you evangelize, you do a lot of good things to build up the body of Christ. And among those things, you've got in your repertoire, as it were, Word Made Flesh, an incarnational theology of communication. This was published, November?
That's right.
In Church Life Journal. That's the publication of the McGrath Institute, which is a delightful thing to read, by the way. Why don't you, Noah, say something about you that I didn't say, and then let's get right into the topic that we're going to cover here.
Well, I appreciate the intro, Jake, and certainly happy to be here. Something that you did not say about me. So I also recently finished my Master of Arts in Theology, also at Notre Dame. So the ties run deep at this point. They got the hooks in me pretty good, but certainly happy to introduce that because I think it's representative of what we're discussing today in the essay that I wrote for the Church Life Journal, because it's in many ways a synthesis of my secular professional career, the culmination of that along with my conversion to Catholicism and making sense of those two things in combination. So
excellent.
Yeah.
So I should call you Master. That's what I'm hearing from this.
No. I'm sort of surrounded by genius PhDs and perpetually humbled being at a place like Notre Dame. So please no. I mean, you'll make me feel good temporarily, and then
sure.
Go into work and be humbled.
And you get there in a couple hours, and you're like, oh right. Well, all right, very good. So, Word Made Flesh, an incarnational theology of communication. This has been on my mind lately. Obviously, as a podcast host, or I hate the title YouTuber, so I never use it. But if other people call me that, it's not wrong. I mean, this video goes on YouTube, it goes on Patreon, it goes on Locals, it goes on Instagram, it goes places that I would rather not be. I would rather not be, right? I mean, I enjoy the classical playlist that I find on YouTube. I enjoy when universities host a conference and then they upload the talks. I like that. The doom scrolling, not my thing. The reels, I think that's what they're called, not my thing. I don't even know how to make one. Don't care. But here we are. Like, I'm here, you're here. We are trying to do something dangerous. You call it treacherous in your opening sentence. So give me a piece of your mind here. What is this digital evangelization or preaching Christ in spaces and using devices and tools and platforms that seem to be antithetical to that very purpose?
Well, that's a fascinating way to set up the conversation, because as you mentioned, I mean, there's this acute tension present between the tools that we find ourselves using and really the environment that we find ourselves using these tools in, because I think digital media, it's somewhat overly reductive and unhelpful to think of digital media only as tools that we use. I think the reality is rather that we have entered this new digital media fueled environment in which we're now interacting and engaging and even working and educating, right? I mean, I'm not a professor at Notre Dame, but I've certainly benefited from, these online education offerings that others have, done. And we provide, various YouTube type education. I mean, depending on how you kind of reduce it down. But
you're saying that if I'm hearing you correctly, what we think of or sometimes think of as simply tools are not simply tools. This is an environment, and we have to wrestle with that environment as we seek to bring the message of the gospel, or even as something as simple as if we're not evangelizing directly, because I think of evangelizing as preaching to those who maybe haven't heard or who aren't convinced. But it goes beyond that too. It's educating Catholics and forming people and all that stuff. So what are your thoughts on why, or how rather? Well, let's start with why, because and I'm one of these people who says, why am I doing this? This is harmful to me. It's harmful to the listeners. Yeah, there may be some good in something I say, but there's too much risk. Does that make sense? Too much risk to be doing this all the time.
Well, I think you've set up the tension nicely there, Jake, because there certainly is tension, right? So as Catholics, we are called to evangelize to the ends of the earth. And that explicitly includes now mention of the digital continent, as Cardinal Ratzinger described it. I think he described it then Pope Benedict. But in any case, we have been specifically called not only to evangelize to the ends of the earth, but also to use digital media as a means of evangelization. This doesn't mean certainly that every individual person must use every individual social media. I'm not making anything like that. I'm just saying, kind of in the broadest strokes, the church has made it clear that this is something that we must be willing to enter in order to point people to Christ. Now, that being said, as you set up very nicely, I think, we're not only there is a unique danger, right? This is a uniquely treacherous environment. And I say the word environment intentionally because while we are using new media as tools, we've also now entered a new environment, a new sort of platform of engagement with others, and a new means of interacting with people, with humans. And as a result, I think that if we reduce digital media and the use of digital media for evangelization purposes to tools, we run the risk of not recognizing the inherent dangers of entering a new evangelistic environment. And I think that's something that we as communicators, regardless of what type of communication, whether that's writing or podcasting or YouTubing, if we dare call ourselves such, or teaching more formally, I think there is a need to apply timeless principles, incarnational principles to the modern situation. But to do that, we have to understand that what we're using are not merely neutral tools, but rather this new collection of digital experiences that actually now have become, in many cases, the dominant force in people's social lives, if I could even describe them as such. I mean, in terms of just sort of the disproportionate amount of time spent online. Unless you're, if you're someone who's kind of like a Gen X or someone who is from an older generation and you're kind of like rolling your eyes at me, the data suggests that this is absolutely ubiquitous across generations. Now, to be sure, Gen Z uses social media more than some of the older generations, but this online sort of the epidemic of spending disproportionate amounts of time online versus in incarnational experiences is shared almost universally across generations right now.
Right. And if anyone smirks because they think this doesn't apply to them, they need to ask themselves, how did they just hear you say that? Because this video, if you're laughing right now, I don't spend time online. Oh, really? So, all right. So that's, it's an imperative then, you would say. We're not able to simply completely disconnect. You can reduce, right? And you should reduce prudently digital things in your life. But you can't totally disconnect because we are charged with going forth and making disciples, right? And so if that's what we're going to be up to, it would have been as if, this is kind of the way I was thinking through it the other night, reading your article. If Paul had said to himself, well, I know there's a lot of people in Athens, but it's really bad for me to go to Athens, so I'm not going to go to the Areopagus. Now, all right, hindsight is wasn't really successful anyways, but that's beside the point. He didn't know that at the time. So in his mind, well, lots of folks here, lots of temptations, what if I get distracted? This isn't good. I'll just avoid Athens. I'll go to Corinth, or let me press on to Rome or something. No, you're not allowed to do that. So in a similar way, okay, I'm looking at, here's all the digital platforms I'd rather avoid because of all the obvious pitfalls. No, you're not allowed to do that, Fowler. If you're going to make a video talking about theology, you have to do the thing where those who you might, uh, you have to go where the people are so that they can hear you. Because if I don't put this on YouTube, who's going to hear it? Right? I could put it on whatever. You get the idea. So it's an imperative. And Noah, what are we going to do then to ensure that our efforts at evangelization and digital communication don't get carried away in the tide? Like you've given us a nice, four anchors. I think you call them anchors. Four anchors for how to maintain an incarnational communication even online.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think I will just say, to add on quickly to the previous point, excuse me, before we move on, is just to say that I do want to belabor the point a little bit, that I don't think everyone has to engage with everyone on every social media platform. I think there's certainly an element of discernment present even for the modern evangelist, who I think should be open to the use of social media. So I do think that there's like a principled openness to using digital media that is an imperative. But I think that that particular use of each particular social media and how we use it, I think actually maybe that's a nice segue into the how, right? So the why,
Yeah,
we have to be kind of open in the broadest sense, because it is where the people are, as you put. But the how, I think, is where the discernment is present. I think we have to know ourselves. I think we have to know the particular dangers of each social media, weigh the risks with the rewards, and I think that's something that has come down to a lot of individual discernment. So I just want to mention that to people who are,
no, that's fair.
balking at the use of TikTok, for example, which is one of the perhaps most horrendous examples of like social media, because it's just like rapid fire, frenetically paced
Hmm.
reels, right? And I sometimes post to TikTok and then I avoid consuming TikTok like the plague. Like, is that a good balance? Maybe. I don't know. So far, it's worked out okay. But if it starts to lure me into the point where I'm consuming to the point where that consumption is detrimental to my creation, then
Sure.
I actually might retreat from TikTok. I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful to use that as a little case study, but I thought we might dive in there real quick.
No, I think that's perfectly acceptable because, you may not know this. I'm a high school teacher. I teach 12th
Mm,
grade theology at a
I
local
didn't know.
Catholic school. And so I'll frequently have students come to me and say, "Oh, did you see that TikTok where the guy did this or the girl did that?" No, I didn't. What? Tell me about it. Oh, well, she spent a minute talking all about how God is the creator.
Mm,
Uh, Really? People on TikTok do that? Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Here, look, here's this same lady again. She's talking about how people need to read the Bible more and shame on those that don't. Oh, okay. So that woman, who knows what her consumption habits are like, but her creation, I couldn't tell you her name, but her creation, that reached a couple of people.
hmm
So for you to
Praise
do it,
God. Yeah.
yeah, amen. For you to do the same thing, let me just drop this on here and then run away like it's on fire. Um, that's a good strategy because you're going to get somebody who's on there already. Maybe they don't notice the fire. Um, and when they scroll and they're like, oh, what's this? Church life? Never heard of that. Interesting. So there's value there. So I applaud you for that. I'm not brave enough to do TikTok.
Well, it is a particularly dangerous one, because I mean, I say that, and I mean, if you have a particular proclivity towards lustful thoughts, the second you pull it up, there's going to be girls dancing kind of like on the screen and like kind of on the
Mm,
reels and all that type of stuff. So I do want to like put a caution there that like TikTok is not where I'm saying go there first
don't do
necessarily.
it.
Like, to all those, especially male, digital evangelists out there, like that's not necessarily where I would say devote your most time. But I think I'm using it as an example because I think it's emblematic of
Hmm.
that principle and also of that discernment that's required in order to apply the principle. Because there's the principle, it's a morally permissible place to enter as a Catholic in order to achieve evangelistic outcomes. I would argue that. So I would put that in an absolute statement. but I wouldn't say that it's morally good for every evangelist to enter TikTok as, in order to further their particular mission. And I think that's where the discernment is. However, if all Catholics were to retreat from TikTok, my goodness, how much worse would it be? So it's an interesting the tension. There's lots of tension here, and I think that maybe brings us back to the question that you asked me that I avoided, but I didn't mean to avoid. I did want to come back to it, but it's like how do we make sense of it and kind of move forward
Mhm.
when we're trying to evangelize in digital media, in the digital landscape? And I don't think what I've devised is a perfect solution by any means, but what I wrote in this article for Church Life Journal, and it's actually a reflection of my master's research as well, um, is a framework, and I think it's a helpful framework. And I'm looking down here at my screen, which is why I'm looking off camera, but I think the four marks, or four marks that help us formulate what it means to use digital media for incarnational communication purposes. That's sort of the end of these marks, is to devise communication strategies that are Trinitarian, that are Christocentric, that are sacramental, and that are relational. And I think that these pillars or marks, I think I've described them as such in a couple different ways, form a framework to help us in the discernment that we just alluded to, in our attempts to apply these principles to our own work. And I'm happy to dive kind of into what those mean, or whatever, but that's the sort of the general lay of the land.
Well, so, yeah, let's do that. Let's take them one by one. But I just noticed, this is me at whatever hour it is here. So for some forms of communication to be Trinitarian, Christocentric, sacramental, and relational, in a way, those are all synonyms. So they're already highly intertwined with one another, right? The perichoresis runs deep here. But as we'll see in a moment, listeners and viewers, Bradon will pretty soon explain exactly why they're not identical, but they are related. So Noah, please, Trinitarian communication, what do we do? What is that? How do we do it? What's your vision here, my man?
Yeah, what an astute observation too about the similarities between them, because it really is almost like layers of, in which you go kind of deeper into the various layers. So like they're both deeply related to one another and inseparable, and yet there is a distinct and I
Yeah.
think unique value offering to each one of them. But no, that's, yeah, I like your framing of that. But Trinitarian, so I think not only is the Trinity, of course, not I think, right? Remove the I think from that. The Trinity is foundational to the Catholic faith. We all know this, and I think it's a natural place to begin most, if not all, theological endeavors, just sort of a reflection on the nature of God. And I think that for this particular case, one of the things that's most fascinating to me about the Trinity is that God not only creates through an act of communication, but God is in a perpetual state of internal communication, if I can dare say as much.
Okay.
At least there's sort of an inter Trinitarian communication that occurs in the way that God exists, the way that God is. And not only that, but of course, moving into the creation element, God spoke the world into existence. I mean, there's this deeply communicative element of creation.
Hmm.
And I think that it's sourced from the way that the Trinity, God, the triune God, values communication and relationship, not to jump ahead, so much so that his very existence is in a perpetual state of interrelationship, intercommunication.
Wow. Okay. That is quite good. And so then you sort of give etymology of that word, which I think also helps to amplify what you're saying. So the root, right, in Latin, the root for communication rests on communion. That is having a relation with another. It wouldn't really be communication if it was just a person speaking and no one hearing, or a person writing and no one reading. So it automatically presumes the presence of another, right? And in the Trinity, you've got this eternal other, right, times three. So how does that, like, when I go on and start running my mouth in front of the microphone, in order to be properly Trinitarian according to this framework,
Mhm.
can you give me one suggestion? Like, how do I do that?
Yeah, well, I think in a sense you just gave us the answer, and I appreciate that you connected it to communion because I probably should have mentioned that. But communication, in order to be Trinitarian, in order to be Christian, and I would say in order to be communication, properly speaking,
Hmm.
must be oriented toward communion. And I think that this is something that we must be particularly mindful when we're in this broadcast type environment where our audience is easily reduced to the impersonal avatar that we see on screen. But the reality is, if we actually seek to communicate in any properly Catholic sense, we must actually be desiring, well, the good of the other, right? If we're seeking to love them, desiring the good of them for that, for the sake of that. But also, we should be desiring communion with them, both in the sense that we're desiring their communion with Christ, but then ultimately, with our being in communion with Christ, we're desiring our communion with them, right? Because as Christians, we're seeking not only to point all to Christ, but also to unite all of us under Christ. I mean, there's sort of this unitive and communicative element to it. So I would say to remember that they are actually people on the other side of those screens. You know, there are people behind the screens, so to speak, and even if they aren't acting in accordance with their human dignity when they're screaming at you on Twitter, you're not there to you're not there to teach them. You're not there to correct their behavior on Twitter. You're there to entice curiosity about the truth. You're there to encourage them to seek Christ. And if it's the point of, I don't know, does that make any sense? I don't know if I landed the
No, no, it
point
makes a
quite
lot of
there,
sense.
but
Yeah. So grounding our communication in the initial awareness and an intentional awareness that there is a receiver, right? Somebody is going to hear or see or read this thing, whatever we've produced, and that person is a person, right? Just like me, holding all things equal, a person just like me, just like you. And so, how do I want to be spoken to? How would I want to be Twitter evangelized or something like that? And I think that's very helpful. So let's move to the second one then. What would we say? What would you say about incarnational as part of this framework? Or
yeah.
I'm
So I
sorry,
mean,
Christocentric.
well,
Christocentric. My fault.
Christocentric, but of course the no, it's a natural mistake because this entire framework is in order to establish an incarnational framework for communication. So it's a natural mistake, but Christocentric. So I would say that in the Trinity, kind of moving beyond the Trinity into how God spoke the world into existence. Right? We think about John 1, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that, of course, that Word is Christ. The incarnate Word is one of his titles that I love deeply, and this is the culmination of God's self gift, right? So the Trinity sort of sets the stage for this perpetual act of internal communication and communion. And then the incarnation, right? This Christocentric focus, culminating in the incarnation of Christ, capital I, is the premier representation of God's act of self gift to us, which then incorporates us into his plan for salvation. So it's an act of communication that then incorporates us into his plan for salvation, making us little mini communicators, then kind of incorporating ourselves into it. So it's almost this like macro example of the
Hmm.
microcosm that we as digital evangelists seek to emulate, right? We're trying to become incarnational evangelists using the means at our disposal. Well, Christ, God, took on flesh, took on the incarnate means at his disposal in a sense, and almost became a living medium for the message of salvation. And I'm alluding there to Marshall McLuhan as well, who championed the medium is the message concept, right?
Hmm.
And that's something that's like deeply integral to media ecology principles and something that we think a lot about at McGrath. But it relates here because Christ is the capital M medium that is the message incarnate to us, and I think that his example, the way that he communicated, by taking on flesh, but also in the way that he lived and died and saved us, is emblematic of how we should approach our own use of media.
Okay, so Noah, it seems like then that this may be a crude analogy, but I think it's an analogy nonetheless, that the dynamic of the eternal God becoming temporal in the person of Christ, taking on humanity and living here, right, amidst the dirt and the sheep and all that. There's an analogy there, and it's a rough one, I admit, with us entering into this digital environment. It's not the environment that's natural to us. We almost have to take on another nature, right? That may be a bit of a stretch, but you see where I'm going with this. Like we're going out of ourselves so that we can go find that lost digital sheep, right? Communicate to that person in a way they can receive it. That's another thing that I think is implicit in your article, which I've now put up in front of me here, is that an underlying assumption you've made is that we have to communicate in a way that people can receive it, right? The quid recipitur, right? Whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. If the mode of the receiver is from my phone to my face 6 inches away, then that's where the evangelization message needs to be. So similarly, God becoming man, right? He's like, all right, well, how am I going to talk to these people? I made these people down here. What am I going to do? Oh, I'll become a man. This is great. And so we're thinking to ourselves, well, how am I going to reach that 17-year-old that scrolls all day long? Oh, I know. I'll make a reel. So I think there's an analogy there. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a fair analogy. I think that the discomfort that we feel engaging in a new environment is something that has been felt by missionaries, throughout church history as well. I think about, the early church especially. I mean, how frequently they had to enter uncomfortable, even hostile environments. And I'm not trying to say that they are I'm not trying to equate the two necessarily, but I think that there's a clear parallel between that willingness to sacrifice, that willingness to be uncomfortable for sake of spreading the gospel. And I say that because I think there tends to be, I think that Catholics often go one of two directions when it comes to their use of digital media in the world of evangelization. They
Mhm.
tend to either celebrate it without reservation, almost celebrating this as the single best thing that has ever happened to Christian mission work. I've heard this type of language. Even this week, I saw posts to that end. And in a sense, they're right, in the sense of the unprecedented reach that we now have, the unparalleled access to every corner of the earth. I mean, almost literally, that the internet has afforded us. In that sense, I would agree that it's the sort of the best of all times, for
Mhm.
missionaries. But to do that without recognizing the novel dangers, and I think that there are novel dangers that we've been alluding to a little bit, but the fact that you are entering a new environment, and we're also entering an environment whose negative impacts we not only don't fully understand, but we won't fully understand until long after they've already impacted us. So what I mean by that is just to peel
Mm.
back the layer there. I think there's this interesting subpoint. I can't remember if I mentioned it in this article or if I've written about it in related things, but we are digital technology is progressing so rapidly that we quite literally are playing a game of perpetual catch up when it comes to understanding the effects of it on individuals, on society, right? And we have some indicators already coming out, related to social media's not relatively, their very detrimental impact on youth mental health and the like. We're starting to get some of those, but here's the challenge. People have already been using social media in extreme amounts for over a decade, right? So we're just kind of now starting to understand the effects of something that has been affecting us for 10 years. Meanwhile, we're already using new technology about which we know even less, right? So the point of that being is that the speed of research and data analysis is woefully under-equipped compared to the speed of progress and innovation. And so it creates this tension that's actually being exacerbated in time because
Hmm.
we continue to embrace novel technology openly, willingly, as if there is nothing to fear about it. And then
Oh,
meanwhile, the actual valid data that would suggest otherwise is coming out, but it's coming out so late that people don't care and they're already moved on to the next new technology. I don't want to paint like a dark apocalyptic picture, but I
no.
think it's a real danger. And I'm speaking to people who are only positive about social media in the digital evangelization landscape. So I'm not all
Yeah, no,
negative either,
there's a
right? But
balance.
there's tension, there's balance.
Yes, that's a good word, tension. Because okay, if you're one of these folks who are oblivious, willfully or otherwise, to the dangers, then yeah, Noah, you need to mention that often. And if you're one of these people who, so I tend toward the other side. I tend toward the yeah, but this isn't good for anyone, so I'm not going to do it side. And I mean, look, here I am, so I'm doing it. But I think that's a worthy objection to wrangle with. Somebody could say, a sociologist, for example, or a brain scientist, whatever those guys are called, they could say, "Hey, this is bad for you, and it's bad for you in ways we don't even realize yet. It could be far worse than we know. So maybe don't do it." What would you say if somebody was like, "Look, just stop for your own health, for your family, for your friends, just stop."
I mean, I think that there is a discernment element. So if as an individual you are battling extreme anxiety, if social media use is leading to depression, and it certainly can, and has for many people, if it is causing you to hate those around you, and not to see Christ in people, or to see Christ, if it's even harder to see Christ in the other as a result of your use of social media, I think those are all strong signals that you should step back. Now, does that mean step back and never return? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It depends. And I think this is where it depends on who your audience is here. But if you are a Catholic apologist or an evangelist, or someone who is seeking to reach those with a particular message, I think that gives a lot more weight to being open to the use of digital media, right? So I guess it's sort of like a vocational, it depends vocationally, and then it also
Okay.
depends personally. So like if you have personal moral struggles, I think that should be absolutely a factor here, whether it's,
Okay.
like we mentioned earlier, like the lustful type things, or whether it's like the hate, or whatever it is. But then on the other side, I don't know.
No, that makes
Maybe keep
sense.
us sane, but I think that was, yeah, something
That
to
makes
consider.
sense. And although I will say there is a lot to that line of thinking, to that objection, I think you overcome it well in your
Mm.
paper. So we've got maybe, let's say, to be safe, 5 minutes, because we know we'll talk more. We've got about 5 minutes to conclude this first installment here. Um, and what can we say about communication being sacramental? Right, digital
Mm.
communicate, person to person communication. We could think of all kinds of ways that that's sacramental. But if I'm going to do it digitally, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think about this in an abstract sense, and then I also think about this in particular senses. So in the abstract sense, thinking more about sacramentality versus, sacramentology, or the particular sacraments. But I'm kind of drawing a lot on Louis Bouillet and kind of his vision of the cosmos, which is an excellent book, for those of you listening who haven't read it. But there is an inherent sacramentality to creation. You know, God has created sacramentally, and I know I'm just repeating myself there, but we not only have been gifted with particular sacraments, you know, the 7 sacraments, but we've also exist in a sense in a world that is injected with inherent sacramentality. And I think that speaks to its sacredness. I think it speaks to its inherent purpose, the elevation of the mundane for use of sacred means. And we see this, you know, throughout the Old Testament, you know, prior to the church, but then we also see it, you know, more acutely in particular sacraments. I mean, the Eucharist, you know, being chief among them, in the sense that God used a particular medium, bread and wine, and elevated and redeemed their very existence and turned them into something else entirely as a result, you know, through transubstantiation. And I'm speaking somewhat poetically here, not like precisely theologically, lest anyone kind of like start throwing darts at me. But I think it's all fairly accurate to say that. And so we can, I think, follow that model by elevating the use of the mundane. And I think that in this case, that could be applied to digital media, the use of social media, the use of things that are seemingly ordinary, perhaps even unimpressive. Does that make some sense? So I think we can, by approaching them intentionally and with these communion-oriented ends, I think we can elevate the use of media in a sacramental sense. So I'm sort of like painting in very
that's good.
broad strokes, but that's kind of the summary version of it, I think.
Excellent. Well, I think in the interest of time, we need to pause here. Mr. Bradon and I spoke off camera, ladies and gents. There will exceedingly likely be a part 2, if not a 3, depending on how thick the conversation becomes next time. But I like, I really enjoy. First of all, I enjoyed reading through your article three times.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
It's because I'm a slow learner. So I think you're spelling it out, and you're addressing objections you may not even realize you're addressing. Excuse me. And so this conversation has gone fantastically. For one, the Trinitarian aspect of incarnate communication, the Christocentric aspect, now the sacramental aspect. In our next bit, we'll speak about the 4th and final one in your paper, and that's going to lead us into all manner of conversations about how to cultivate relationship when you're 300 miles away, like you and I are right now. We're hundreds of miles apart, and we're building a relationship in tandem with a common goal and so on. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I do want to play some music. All right. So Noah Bradon of the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. Thanks again. Again, I mean, it's amazing. It's delightful. Here's some free airtime, brother. What do you want to plug? Promote yourself.
Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm trying to actively encourage myself to see the people behind the screens, and I'm trying to help others cultivate a healthy relationship with digital media. So whether you're a digital evangelist proper, or whether you're just someone who engages in digital media and wants to do it in a better way, I'd encourage you to check out the McGrath Institute's website, McGrath, mcgrath.nd.edu. We have done a variety of media ecology related research, which is to say understanding the media environment as an environment, not just as a collection of tools. And I think some of that research would be valuable to you. And if I dare also plug my YouTube channel, it's just my name, at Noah Bradon. And I talk about these and other things that are interesting to me. So I've used up way too much of my free airtime, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, you should dare.
The marketer in me has to, right? The marketer, I'm like, okay,
So,
free billboard.
all right, next time, Next time, be prepared. I will ask you. So whenever I formally conclude an interview, I don't know how formal this is, but whenever I conclude an interview, I always ask the guest, what do you recommend people to read? So next time, when
Ooh.
we finish up with part 2 or part 3 or whatever, I will ask you, what should people be reading? But for now, never give up. Keep on smiling, and memento mori.